Look at the rest of the chapter. We will kind of handle it generically or generally more than clinically, and focus again on the importance of separation, on the importance of holiness for God's people, purity in God's people that is pictured by all these laws. Right? It's all about separation. It's all about being different for the nation of Israel than their neighbors, and it's a good picture for us that we should be different from our neighbors as far as the world and those who don't believe. So next we look at the instructions for the priests to identify the condition. Verse 3 it says, "And the priest shall look on the plague in the skin of the flesh, and when the hair of the plague is turned white, and the plague in sight be deeper than the skin of his flesh, it is a plague of leprosy, and the priest shall look on him and pronounce him unclean." And so the identifying marks there, the hair, which was typically very dark among the Jewish population, amongst the children of Israel, if it had turned white as a result of this spot that had been discovered, or if the sore looks like it's not just on the surface but goes deep into the flesh, those are the signs that they were to look for. If those were found, then the person was deemed leprous and unclean, and they would have to follow the instructions that are given later on in the chapter. Verses 4 through 8, the law addresses those occasions where the diagnosis is not really clear-cut, where it's not obvious what's going on. Verse 4, "If the bright spot be white in the skin of his flesh, and in the sight be not deeper than the skin, and the hair thereof be not turned white, then the priest shall shut up him that hath the plague 7 days. And the priest shall look on him the 7th day, and behold, if the plague in his sight be at a stay, and the plague spread not in the skin, then shall the priest shut him up 7 days more. And the priest shall look on him again the 7th day, and behold, if the plague be somewhat dark, and the plague spread not in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is but a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab spread much abroad in the skin, after that he hath been seen of the priest, and of his for his cleansing, he shall be seen of the priest again. And if the priest see that, behold, the scab spreadeth in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprosy." It makes sense what's written here. Again, I'm not going to try to go into all the details in the world. It is pretty self-explanatory. If it's not obvious that it is leprous, there's question regarding it, then the person's basically put in quarantine for a week. The priest looks again. If it still hasn't spread, it's another week. After that week, if he looks at it, it still hasn't spread, he is considered clean. Does that mean that they're definitely not leprous? Not necessarily, because it does go into the details. Well, what happens if after those 2 weeks, right? Because most of us would say, well, I got my clean bill of health, I'm good to go, right? If it begins to spread, if those symptoms do show up that point toward leprosy, he is to go back to the priest, who then would examine it once more, and if it was fit the criteria, then he would be considered unclean. At any point here, I know it just talks about if he's clean after 7 days, then you go 7 more days, and if he's clean after that, you go on. If at any of these points it is clear that it is leprous, it has the white hair, it has the sore deeper than the skin and the spreading of it, then at that point, whatever point that was, whether that was after the first 7 days or the second 7 days or even sometime after that, when those symptoms arise, it is to be addressed and dealt with in the proper way. So this covers a lot of different situations, and in essence, a lot of what we cover in the following verses are just kind of variations on this theme, right? The same basic process is followed, but it does deal with some specific circumstances in the next several verses. The next section deals with another case that may be different, or a different type of leprosy, or it could be a case where the leprosy didn't have outward signs. It was more internal for a period, and then it kind of came out quickly and in a very severe state. Verses 9 through 11. Excuse me. The Bible says, "When the plague of leprosy is in a man, then he shall be brought unto the priest, and the priest shall see him, and behold, if the rising be white in the skin, and it have turned the hair white, and there be quick raw flesh in the rising, it is an old leprosy in the skin of his flesh, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall shut him up, for he is unclean." And so this, again, its symptoms seem to have developed rapidly into a severe state. You don't wait around. You don't have to wait 7 days. When it's identified, he's pronounced unclean and he is put away or separated. And again, that's part of the procedure for dealing with lepers, is that they would be separated from society. They would be kind of removed from the city that they were in. They would have leper colonies sometimes outside of cities where they would dwell together. Because obviously they don't have risk of infecting one another because they already had the disease. But they were separated and they were outcast to a certain degree because of the severity of this disease. Verses 12 through 17 describes a scenario that does seem a little unusual when you first read through it. Verse 12, and if a leprosy break abroad in the skin, and the leprosy cover all the skin of him that hath the plague, from his head even to his foot, whithersoever the priest looketh, then the priest shall consider, and behold, if the leprosy have covered all his flesh, he shall pronounce him clean. That hath the plague, it is all turned white, he is clean. But when the raw flesh appeareth in him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall see the raw flesh and pronounce him to be unclean, for the raw flesh is unclean, it is a leprosy. Or if the raw flesh turn again and be changed into white, he shall come unto the priest, and the priest shall see him, and behold, if the plague be turned into white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, that hath the plague, he is clean. So you have this situation where if the person is completely covered in the leprosy, and it's white as it describes there, scabbed over, and covered in the way that disease progresses, that he would be considered clean. For me, I'm thinking, well, if he's got it all over, that seems way worse than if he's just got a little spot on it, right? Probably what's going on here, again, this could be a variation or a different type of leprosy. It could be a little bit different skin disease of some sort. It could be leprosy in the more traditional sense. But the idea being that there are stages of the disease when it is more transmissible than other stages in the disease. If you have a cold or flu or whatever, and I don't know if this is exactly right, so don't get mad if I'm not right. But if you have a fever, then you're probably contagious. If you don't have a fever, then it may not be contagious, right? Well, in this situation, if it's completely covered and there's no growth of the disease in the person, or there's no symptoms or signs of these raw flesh being exposed and those kind of things, then he would be considered clean, because apparently it would not be transmissible at that point or as contagious at that point as it would be otherwise. If things change, if symptoms arise that once again show that it's active, then the person is unclean once more. Kind of an interesting thing about this is the idea that for the most part, there weren't any clean lepers, right? There wasn't anybody who had gone through it who ended up in this state. In fact, there were very few who became clean at all, because leprosy, especially in that day, was incurable. Now there are some medications and ways of treating it, and it can be cured, but certainly in that day that wasn't an option apart from a direct act of God. That was the only way that leprosy was dealt with. And so as we get to some of the things later on when it talks about what to do when you are clean, you look at that from a natural sense and say, well, why waste your time, right? Because that's not going to happen. But God is God, and he knew that there were going to be some occasions where it did happen. And so he made provision for that as well. But here we do have this kind of unique situation, apparently dealing with the transmissibility of it and how contagious it might be based on what stage of the disease that it's in. Next, we have a situation where the leprosy develops from another skin condition, a burn or a boil, verses 18 through 28. The flesh also, in which even the skin thereof was a boil, and is healed. And in the place where the boil and in the place of the boil there be a white rising, or a bright spot, white and somewhat reddish, and it be shown to the priest. And if when the priest seeth it, behold, it be in sight lower than the skin, and the hair thereof be turned white, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague of leprosy broken out in the boil. But if the priest look on it, and behold, there be no white hairs therein, and if it be not lower than the skin, but be somewhat dark, then the priest shall shut him up 7 days. And if it spread much abroad in the skin, Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague, but if the bright spots stay in place and spread not, it is a burning boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or if there be any flesh in the skin whereof there is a hot burning, and the quick flesh that is burned have a white bright spot, somewhat reddish or white, then the priest shall look upon it, and behold, if the hair in the bright spot be turned white, and it be in sight deeper than the skin, it is a leprosy broken out of the burning, wherefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague of leprosy. But if the priest look on it, and behold, there be no white hair in the bright spot, and if it be no lower than the other skin, but somewhat dark, then the priest shall then the priest shall shut him up 7 days, and the priest shall look upon him the seventh day, and if it be spread much abroad in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague of leprosy. And if the bright spot stay in his place and spread not in the skin, but be somewhat dark, it is a rising of the burning, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is an inflammation of the burning. So, there you go. I don't know what to add to that, other than it kind of follows the same procedure that we saw earlier, with the exception that there's only 1 week of isolation for the person instead of 2 weeks as it was in other cases. That probably has to do with the source of the spot that had risen up, and the likelihood that it was just a result of a burn or a boil or something along those lines. But again, if later on those symptoms arise, if later on the white hair shows up, if later on the spot begins to spread and gets deeper in the skin, anytime that happens, it's cause for bringing it to the priest and looking at it and declaring it to be leprosy and the person to be unclean. So again, just variations on the theme, different situations and specific circumstances that are dealt with here, and it gives me a lot to read. So I'm sure you all enjoy that. The next section this evening deals with spots in the head or beard, areas that are covered by hair typically, verses 29 through 37. And if a man or woman have a plague upon the head or the beard, then the priest shall see the plague, and behold, if it be in sight deeper than the skin, and there be in it yellow hair or yellow thin hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a dry scald, even leprosy upon the head or beard. And if the priest look on the plague and the skull, and behold, it be not in sight deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall shut him up that hath the plague of the skull 7 days. And in the seventh day the priest shall look on the plague, and behold, if the skull be spread not, and there be in it no yellow hair, and the skull be not in sight deeper than the skin, he shall be shaven, but the skull shall he not shave. And the priest shall shut him up that hath, or shut up him that hath the skull even, or 7 more days. 37, okay. And in the seventh day, the priest shall look on the skull, and behold, if the skull be not spread in the skin, nor be in sight deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the skull spread much in the skin after the cleansing, then the priest shall look on him, and behold, if the skull be spread in the skin, and the priest shall not seek for yellow hair, he is unclean. But if the skull be in his sight at a stay, and that the black hair is grown up therein, the skull is healed, he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. That's a lot of reading. I'm not good at reading, and my eyes don't work as good as they used to. Again, here, it's another situation, another specific. If the spot is in the head or somewhere that's typically covered by hair, he examines it. If there's uncertainty, you shave the area, you shave the head entirely except for the spot where the infection is or the spot is, and you watch it. And after 7 days, if it's spread, it's leprosy. If it hasn't spread, then you wait 7 more. And again, it's the same process that we've seen several times now. The conditions being very similar to what was discussed in the things in the previous instances. Verses 38 and 39 deal with yet another situation. This one is mistakenly sometimes taken for leprosy. 38. If a man also or a woman have in the skin of their flesh bright spots, even white spots, or white bright spots, then the priest shall look, and behold, if the bright spots in the skin of the flesh be darkish white, it is a freckled spot that groweth in the skin, he is clean. So this mark may have been sunspots or some other surface discoloration in the skin. It wasn't as white as leprosy. It's somewhat darker than that. And there was no depth to it. He is considered clean. And so this one is a specific situation that could be addressed pretty quickly. Again, probably a fairly common skin ailment that they dealt with, that they could look at and say, this is or is not leprosy easily. And so that one didn't require as much study or a period of isolation for the individual. We'll finish up this evening with one last area concerning or that's focused on men, primarily of Israel, verse 40 through 44. And the man whose hair is fallen off his head, he is bald, yet he is clean. That's good for us, huh? He is clean. Verse 41, and he that hath hair fallen off from the part of his head forward, or toward his face, he is forehead bald, yet is he clean. And if there be any if there be in the bald head or bald forehead a white reddish sore, it is leprosy sprung up in his bald head, in his bald forehead. Then the priest shall look upon it, and behold, if the rising of the sore be white reddish, it is a bald in his bald head, or in the bald forehead, as the leprosy appeareth on the skin of the flesh. He is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him utterly unclean. His plague is in his head. And so that's for those who are lacking in the hair department. I'm getting there, so I'd fall under this category, I suppose. But you just had to repeat it over and over, huh? Bald, 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 bald. But for the most part, they were clean, so that's a good thing. But again, if a spot arises, if it bears the signs of leprosy, take it to the priest, let the priest judge, and go through the process that is prescribed for that. And so I know that's a lot to cover, a lot of verses anyway. Same basic idea though, and I don't think it's too terribly complicated. Like I said, I didn't want to try to get into clinical descriptions of all these things because I don't know that would benefit us any, and it's kind of gross to some degree, so we'll just pass on the details of it. But understand that the point being, number one, this did have an application as far as the practical protection of the children of Israel, as far as sanitation and those kind of things. While leprosy actually wasn't a terribly highly contagious disease, the problems that it brings are terribly severe. It's incurable, and it would basically cause the body to completely deteriorate over time. And it was a long, drawn-out process. It was a miserable existence, a hard life to live. And so while not terribly transmissible, the fact that it was transmissible was enough to say, this is serious, this is something bad, and we don't want it spreading throughout Israel. And that was especially pertinent while they're traveling toward the promised land and then 40 years in the wilderness. Because you've got a lot of people in a relatively small area as they were encamping in the different places where they stopped. And this is a situation that even if it's not terribly transmissible with that many people in that small of an area, if it did begin to spread, you're talking about very serious consequences. And so it was taken very seriously. But on the other side, as far as the spiritual application of it, again, it highlights the importance of purity. It highlights the importance of separation and staying away from sin. Leprosy is often used as an illustration for sin in the scriptures, with good reason, right? It's ever present. It's always there. There's always a potential there. You have to be on guard for it. You have to look for it in your life and examine yourself. It brings terrible consequences. Horrible results come from sin. And so there's a lot of parallels there and a lot of good advice that we can learn because even though we're under the law and leprosy isn't a disease that probably any of us will ever come into contact with, the idea of sin and the consequences of sin and the exposure that we have to sin is certainly much greater. And yet it is just as serious and just as severe. And so a good lesson, even though it is a little bit toilsome to go through. Next week we'll continue in it, and we'll look at some of the other situations concerning leprosy, going beyond just individual, but looking at the clothing and garments and things like that, as well as households and other things that could be infected that would need to be handled. So we'll get into that next week, as well as maybe some of the cleansing and the process of dealing with leprosy. So any questions or comments?